The gunshot that killed Thomas Vance's father missed the three hunting dogs by inches, and in the chaos that followed, the boy learned what mattered most when the world fell apart. Thomas was 19 years old in the spring of 1882, standing over his father's grave in Quartz Hill, California, with nothing to his name but a ramshackle cabin, 3 loyal hounds, and a determination that burned hotter than the desert sun beating down on his shoulders. His father had been a prospector, one of the many men who had flooded into the hills northeast of Los Angeles hoping to strike it rich in the gold mines. What he had struck instead was a dispute with claim jumpers who did not believe in settling matters with words. The dogs, Rusty, Duke, and Belle, had been his father's constant companions in those hills, and now they were Thomas's entire family. The first thing Thomas did after the funeral was feed the dogs. His stomach gnawed at him with hunger, empty since the morning before, but he could not bring himself to take a single bite until he watched all 3 hounds finish their portions. It was what his father would have done. It was what felt right. The dogs looked up at him with grateful eyes, tails wagging, and only then did Thomas allow himself to break off a piece of stale bread and force it down his throat. The pattern continued through the following weeks. Thomas took whatever work he could find in Quartz Hill, a dusty settlement that sprawled across the arid landscape where the Mojave Desert began its slow creep toward the San Gabriel Mountains. He hauled lumber for the new buildings going up along Main Street. He mucked out stables. He worked security at the saloon when the regular man took ill. Every cent he earned went toward keeping himself and the dogs alive, but the dogs always ate first. Always. It became a ritual that defined his days. Come evening, no matter how exhausted Thomas felt, no matter how his muscles ached or his head pounded, he would prepare 3 bowls of food, scraping together whatever meat scraps he could trade for or afford, mixing in day-old bread or vegetables that the general store could not sell. He would set the bowls down and watch the dogs eat with a satisfaction that went beyond logic. Only after they had finished, after he had checked that each had gotten enough, would he consider his own meal. Most nights, that meal was meager. Thomas grew lean, his frame already tall and rangy becoming almost gaunt. His clothes hung loose on his shoulders, but the dogs stayed healthy and strong, their coats gleaming, their energy boundless. When people in town commented on how well kept his hounds were compared to his own worn appearance, Thomas would just shrug and change the subject. Margaret Foster arrived in Quartz Hill on a Wednesday afternoon in late June, stepping off the stagecoach with a single trunk, a carpet bag, and an expression of quiet determination that immediately caught Thomas's attention. He had been walking past the stage office with the dogs at his heels when the coach rumbled to a stop, dust billowing around its wheels. The woman who emerged was perhaps 20 years old, with dark hair pinned up beneath a simple bonnet and eyes that scanned the town with an intelligence that suggested she missed nothing. She was pretty, Thomas noticed, though not in the delicate way that men often described women in the dime novels that circulated through the saloon. There was something solid about her, something capable. She moved with purpose as she collected her trunk, waving off the driver's half-hearted offer of assistance. Thomas found himself walking over before he had quite decided to do so. "Can I help you with that, miss?" he asked, nodding toward the trunk. Margaret looked him over with an assessing gaze that took in his worn clothes, his too thin frame, and the 3 dogs sitting obediently at his feet. Something flickered in her expression, though Thomas could not quite read it. "I can manage," she said, but her tone was not unkind. "Though I would appreciate directions to the boarding house if you know where it is." "I can show you," Thomas offered. "It is not far. I am heading that direction anyway. That was not entirely true, but Margaret did not need to know that. She hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "All right. Thank you." Thomas picked up her trunk, surprised by its weight, and started down the street with Margaret walking beside him and the dogs trailing behind. They made an odd procession through the dusty afternoon heat. "I am Thomas Vance," he said after a moment. "Those are Rusty, Duke, and Belle." "Margaret Foster," she replied. "Are you a hunter? With the dogs, I mean." "Sometimes. They were my father's. He passed recently, so now they are mine." "I am sorry for your loss." The words were simple, but something in the way she said them suggested she understood what loss meant. "What brings you to Quartz Hill, Miss Foster?" "Work," Margaret said. "I am a teacher. The town posted a notice back in Los Angeles that they needed someone for the schoolhouse. I applied and was accepted." Thomas had heard something about that. The previous teacher, an older woman named Mrs. Hendricks, had left suddenly to care for a sick relative back east. The schoolhouse had been closed for nearly 2 months, much to the frustration of the families with children. "That is good," Thomas said. "The town needs a teacher. There are plenty of children here who should be learning." They reached the boarding house, a 2-story structure with a faded sign and a front porch that looked like it might collapse if too many people stood on it at once. Mrs. Garrison, the proprietor, came out to greet them, her face lighting up when she saw Margaret. "You must be Miss Foster. We have been expecting you. Come in, come in. I have your room all ready." Thomas set the trunk down inside the door. Margaret turned to him with a small smile. "Thank you, Mr. Vance. I appreciate your help. It was no trouble." Thomas hesitated, then tipped his hat. "Welcome to Quartz Hill, Miss Foster." He left before she could respond, calling the dogs to follow. As he walked away, he could feel her eyes on his back, though he could not have said why that mattered. The next time Thomas saw Margaret Foster was 3 days later at the general store. He was there to buy food for the dogs, counting out his coins carefully to make sure he had enough. Dog food came first, then he would see what was left for himself. He had learned to make do with very little. Margaret was at the counter talking to Mr. Patterson, the store owner, about setting up a small account for supplies she would need for the school. She glanced over as Thomas approached, and her expression shifted slightly when she saw what he was purchasing. "Mr. Vance," she said with a nod. "Miss Foster." Thomas paid for the bag of scraps and meal that Mr. Patterson had set aside for him, then stepped back to let Margaret continue her business. But Margaret was not done with him. "Mr. Vance, have you eaten today?" The question caught him off guard. "I am fine, miss." "That was not what I asked." Her tone was polite but firm, the tone of someone used to getting straight answers from evasive students. Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "I will eat when I get home." Margaret's eyes dropped to the single bag he carried, clearly meant for the dogs, and then back to his face. Understanding dawned in her expression. "I see. Mr. Vance, would you mind walking me back to the boarding house? I find I could use the company, and Mrs. Garrison mentioned she had made far too much stew this afternoon. I am sure she would not mind if you joined us." It was a transparent excuse, and they both knew it. Thomas should have refused. He had his pride after all, and he did not need charity from a woman he barely knew. But something in Margaret's eyes, a kindness that did not feel like pity, made him pause. "The dogs," he started. "Can come too," Margaret said firmly. "Mrs. Garrison has a large back porch. I am sure they will be comfortable there." Thomas found himself nodding before he could think better of it. The meal at the boarding house was the best thing Thomas had eaten in weeks. Mrs. Garrison's stew was rich with beef and vegetables, served with fresh bread that was still warm from the oven. But what surprised Thomas most was that Margaret did not simply invite him to eat. She made sure of it. when he automatically started to portion out food for the dogs first, using scraps from the kitchen, Margaret appeared at his elbow with 2 bowls of stew. "For us," she said, pressing one into his hands. "The dogs are already eating. Now you eat too." Thomas looked at the back porch where Rusty, Duke, and Belle were indeed happily working their way through generous portions of meat and vegetables. Then he looked at Margaret, who was watching him with an expression that brooked no argument. "Right alongside them," she said quietly. "That is how it should be. You care for them, but you need to care for yourself too." Something in Thomas's chest tightened. He could not remember the last time someone had insisted that he matter as much as the creatures he was responsible for. He sat down at the small table on the back porch where he could see the dogs, and Margaret sat across from him. They ate together as the evening sun painted the sky orange and gold. "Your father must have loved those dogs very much," Margaret said after a while. "He did. They were with him in the hills through everything. When he died, they stayed by his body until I found them. They would not leave him." Thomas's voice was rough with memory. "And now you honor him by caring for them," Margaret said. "It was not a question. I try. They are all I have left of him." Margaret was quiet for a moment, then said, "My parents died of fever 4 years ago. I was 16. I understand what it is like to lose family." "I am sorry," Thomas said, and meant it. "We survive," Margaret replied. "We find ways to keep going. But we do not have to do it alone, and we do not have to sacrifice ourselves in the process." Thomas met her eyes across the table. There was something fierce and gentle in her gaze at the same time, a combination that made his heart beat faster. "Why do you care?" he asked, genuinely curious. "You do not know me." "I know you well enough," Margaret said. "I know you are someone who puts others before yourself, even when those others are animals. I know you work hard and you have been through loss. That is enough to know you deserve kindness." Thomas did not know what to say to that. He focused on his stew instead, but the warmth spreading through his chest had nothing to do with the food. After that evening, things began to change. Margaret made it her mission, in her quiet and determined way, to ensure that Thomas Vance ate proper meals. It started with invitations to join her at the boarding house, always with some excuse about extra food or wanting company. Then it progressed to her showing up at his cabin with baskets of food she claimed were leftovers from Mrs. Garrison's kitchen, though Thomas suspected Margaret was paying for them herself. At first, Thomas resisted. He did not want to be a charity case, did not want this capable, intelligent woman to see him as someone who needed saving. But Margaret was persistent, and more importantly, she was strategic. She never made it seem like she was doing him a favor. Instead, she made it seem like he was doing her one. "I cannot possibly eat all of this myself," she would say, appearing at his door with enough food for 2 people and 3 dogs. "It would be a shame to waste it. Besides, I wanted to ask your advice about something." The something was always different. She wanted to know about the best places to take her students for nature lessons. She wanted his opinion on which families in town might need extra help with school supplies. She wanted to hear stories about the area, about the mines and the desert and the mountains that ringed the valley. Thomas found himself talking more than he had in months, drawn out by her genuine interest and the way she listened like every word mattered. And always, she made sure he ate. If he started to feed the dogs first without taking anything for himself, Margaret would hand him a plate. If he tried to claim he was not hungry, she would sit down with her own food and wait, her expectant silence more effective than any argument, until he joined her. She was relentless in the gentlest possible way, and despite himself, Thomas found his resistance crumbling. The dogs loved her too. Belle, the most cautious of the 3, took to following Margaret around when she visited, leaning against her legs while Margaret scratched behind her ears. Duke, the largest and most energetic, would bring her sticks to throw. Rusty, the oldest, would simply curl up at her feet with a contented sigh. Watching his dogs accept her so completely made something settle in Thomas's chest, like a piece of himself he had not known was missing had finally clicked into place. Summer deepened into July, and the heat became oppressive. Quartz Hill baked under a merciless sun, and everyone moved slowly, trying to conserve energy. Margaret threw herself into preparing the schoolhouse for the fall term, cleaning and organizing and making lists of supplies she would need. Thomas found himself volunteering to help, showing up at the schoolhouse in the early mornings before the heat became unbearable. They worked side by side, scrubbing desks and repairing broken chairs and replacing cracked window panes. The dogs sprawled in the shade outside, panting in the heat but content to wait. Thomas and Margaret talked as they worked, sharing stories and opinions and gradually, carefully, pieces of their hearts. Thomas learned that Margaret had worked as a seamstress in Los Angeles after her parents died, saving every penny she could, until she had enough to attend a teaching college. She had studied at night, exhausted from her days bent over needlework, driven by a fierce determination to make something of herself. She had graduated top of her class and taken the first teaching position offered to her, even though it meant moving to a small mining town in the middle of nowhere. "I wanted somewhere I could make a difference," she said, wiping dust from a windowsill. "In the city, there were dozens of teachers. Here, I am the only one. These children need someone who will fight for them, who will give them a chance at a better future." "They are lucky to have you," Thomas said, and he meant it with his whole heart. Margaret smiled at him, and the warmth in her eyes made Thomas feel like he was standing in direct sunlight even though they were inside the dim schoolhouse. "What about you, Thomas? What do you want for your future?" It was a question no one had asked him since his father died. Thomas paused, hammer in hand, and really thought about it. "I want stability," he said finally. "I want to know that I can take care of what is mine. The dogs, a home, maybe someday more than that. I want to build something that lasts." "That is a good goal," Margaret said softly, "and I think you will achieve it. You are one of the most determined people I have ever met." "I could say the same about you," Thomas replied. Their eyes met and held, and something unspoken passed between them. Thomas felt his pulse quicken. He had been attracted to Margaret from the moment he first saw her, but it was more than that now. He respected her, admired her, cared about her in a way that went deeper than simple attraction, and from the way she was looking at him, he thought she might feel the same. But before either of them could say anything more, the sound of shouting from outside broke the moment. Thomas dropped the hammer and rushed to the door, Margaret right behind him. A group of men on horseback were riding through the center of town, whooping and firing pistols into the air. Thomas recognized them immediately. They were some of the claim jumpers who had been causing trouble in the hills, the same men who had been involved in his father's death. His hands clenched into fists, rage surging through him. "Thomas," Margaret said quietly, her hand on his arm. "Do not do anything foolish." "Those men killed my father," Thomas said, his voice tight. "I know, but getting yourself killed will not bring him back." Thomas knew she was right, but that did not make it any easier. He watched the men ride past, committing each face to memory. One day, when the time was right, there would be a reckoning. But Margaret was right. Today was not that day. The riders disappeared down the street, their laughter fading into the distance. Thomas let out a long breath, forcing his hands to unclench. When he looked at Margaret, he found her watching him with concern and something else. Respect, maybe, for his restraint. "Come on," she said. "We have work to finish." They went back inside, but the easy atmosphere from before had been disrupted. Thomas worked in silence, his mind churning. Margaret seemed to sense his need for quiet and did not push conversation, though she stayed close, her presence a steady comfort. When they finished for the day, Margaret packed up the lunch basket she had brought, making sure Thomas took half of what remained. "For dinner," she said. "You and the dogs." "Margaret," Thomas started, not sure what he wanted to say. "Yes, thank you for everything, for caring." Margaret's expression softened. "You make it easy, Thomas Vance." She left before he could respond, walking back toward the boarding house with her skirts swishing in the dust. Thomas watched her go, the dog sitting at his feet, and felt something very much like hope bloom in his chest. As summer wore on, Thomas and Margaret became a common sight around Quartz Hill. They were not officially courting, nothing had been formally declared, but everyone could see the way things were between them. The way Thomas's face lit up when Margaret appeared. The way Margaret made sure to seek him out every day, bringing food and conversation and a stubborn insistence that he take care of himself. The way they moved around each other with an easy familiarity that spoke of deep comfort and growing affection. Mrs. Garrison at the boarding house started referring to Thomas as Margaret's young man, which made Margaret blush and Thomas duck his head with a shy smile. Mr. Patterson at the general store began setting aside the best cuts of meat for Thomas, claiming they were for Miss Foster's friend, with a knowing wink. Even the sheriff, a gruff man named Coleman who did not much care for gossip, commented that it was nice to see two decent young people finding happiness together. Thomas found himself working harder than ever, taking every job he could find. Part of it was practical. He needed money to survive, to feed himself and the dogs. But part of it was something more. He wanted to be worthy of Margaret Foster. He wanted to be able to offer her something more than a ramshackle cabin and 3 hunting hounds. He wanted to build the kind of future where he could ask her to stay, really stay, not just as a friend, but as something more permanent. Margaret seemed to understand this without him having to say it. She never pushed, never demanded declarations or promises. She simply continued to show up, day after day, with her baskets of food and her quiet insistence that Thomas eat right alongside his dogs. She continued to draw him out, to make him laugh, to remind him that life could hold more than just grief and survival. One evening in late August, Thomas invited Margaret to his cabin for dinner. It was the first time he had done so, and he spent the entire day cleaning and preparing, wanting everything to be perfect. The cabin was small, just one room with a stove, a table, a bed in the corner, and not much else. But he scrubbed it until it shone, hung fresh curtains he had bartered for, and picked wildflowers from the hills to put in a jar on the table. When Margaret arrived, her eyes went wide. "Thomas, this is lovely." "It is not much," he said, suddenly self-conscious. "It is more than enough." Margaret set down the basket she had brought, adding to the meal Thomas had prepared. Together, they cooked dinner, moving around the small space with an easy coordination that felt natural. The dogs watched from their place by the door, tails thumping against the floor. Thomas had made sure to prepare enough food for everyone. He filled 3 bowls for the dogs first, setting them outside on the small porch. Then he filled 2 plates for himself and Margaret, making sure they were equal portions. Margaret noticed, and her smile was radiant. "Look at you," she said warmly. "Feeding yourself at the same time. I am so proud of you." Thomas felt heat creep up his neck. "You taught me that it matters, that I matter, not just the dogs. You do matter, Thomas. You matter very much." They sat down to eat together, the dogs visible through the open door, and for the first time in longer than Thomas could remember, he felt completely at peace. This was what home should feel like. Not just a place, but a person. Not just survival, but connection. After dinner, they sat outside on the porch as the sun set, painting the desert sky in shades of purple and gold. The dogs had finished eating and were sprawled nearby, contentedly dozing. Margaret sat close enough to Thomas that their shoulders almost touched, and the awareness of her nearness made his heart race. "I have been thinking," Margaret said after a long, comfortable silence. "About what? About the future. About what I want from life." She turned to look at him, her expression serious. "I came to Quartz Hill to teach, and I love that work, but I have found something else here too, something I was not expecting." Thomas's throat felt tight. "What is that, you?" Margaret said simply. "I have found you, Thomas. And I do not want to lose that." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Thomas felt like his heart might burst from his chest. "Margaret, I have been wanting to say something, but I was not sure if it was too soon, if I had the right to ask anything of you when I have so little to offer." "Thomas Vance, you stop that right now." Margaret's voice was fierce. "You have everything to offer. You have honor and kindness and a heart bigger than anyone I have ever known. You put others before yourself, even when you should not, and you work harder than any 3 men combined. Do not tell me you have nothing to offer." "I want to offer you everything," Thomas said, the words tumbling out. "I want to offer you my life, my future, whatever I can build. Margaret, I am in love with you. I think I have been since the day you first made sure I ate alongside the dogs, like I was just as worthy of care. I love you, and I want to spend my life with you if you will have me." Margaret's eyes were bright with tears, but she was smiling. "Thomas, I am in love with you too. I have been for weeks now. Yes, I will have you. Yes to all of it." Thomas reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "I want to do this right. I want to court you properly, and then when I have saved enough money, I want to marry you. I want to build us a real home, something better than this cabin. I want to give you the life you deserve." "I already have the life I deserve," Margaret said, squeezing his hand. "I have a job I love, a town I am growing to care about, and a man who sees me as an equal partner. That is more than many women ever get, Thomas. But yes, I want all of that with you. The courting, the marriage, the future, all of it." Thomas lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. "I will make you happy, Margaret, I swear it." "You already do," she said softly. They sat together as the stars came out, hands clasped, the dogs dozing at their feet, and made quiet plans for a future that suddenly seemed bright with possibility. The news of their courtship spread through Quartz Hill like wildfire, met with almost universal approval. The town had taken Margaret to their hearts, grateful to have a dedicated teacher for their children, and Thomas was well liked despite his quiet nature. People were happy to see them together, and many commented that they had known all along it would happen. Thomas began saving money with renewed purpose. Every cent he did not need for immediate survival went into a tin can he kept hidden in the cabin. He worked longer hours, took harder jobs, anything to build up his savings faster. But Margaret made sure, with her usual gentle stubbornness, that he still ate properly and got enough rest. "You will not be any good to me if you work yourself to death," she scolded one evening when he showed up at the boarding house so exhausted he could barely stand. "I want to give you a proper home," Thomas protested. "You are my home," Margaret said firmly. "The building is just details. Now sit down and eat this soup before I force-feed it to you." Thomas sat, too tired to argue, and watched as Margaret efficiently served him a generous portion while also filling bowls for the dogs, who had followed him as always. She set the dogs' food down first, then sat beside Thomas with her own bowl, waiting until he started eating before she began her own meal. It was the routine they had fallen into, a compromise between Thomas's instinct to feed the dogs first and Margaret's insistence that he eat at the same time. The dogs ate, and Thomas and Margaret ate alongside them, a small pack taking care of each other. "I got another letter from the town council today," Margaret said as they ate. "They are very pleased with the enrollment numbers for the school. Apparently, several families are planning to move to Quartz Hills specifically because they heard we have a good teacher now." "Of course they did. You are an excellent teacher." Thomas had sat in on one of Margaret's lessons the week before, ostensibly to fix a broken desk, but really just to watch her work. She had been magnificent, commanding the attention of students ranging from 6 to 14 years old, making even the driest subjects come alive with her enthusiasm and creativity. "I do my best," Margaret said modestly, "but I have been thinking. If more families come, we will need a larger schoolhouse. The current building is already almost full." "The town council will have to approve funds for that," Thomas said, "but you should propose it. They listen to you." "Will you help me draft the proposal?" Margaret asked. "You have a good head for practical matters." "Of course." Thomas would have agreed to help her with anything, but he particularly liked the idea of working on a project together, planning for the town's future in a way that felt like planning for their own. They spent the rest of the evening working on the proposal, their heads bent together over paper and pencil, debating the best way to present their case. The dogs slept in a pile at their feet, occasionally snoring. Mrs. Garrison brought them coffee and fresh biscuits, beaming at them like a proud mother. It was domestic and comfortable, and everything Thomas had not known he wanted until Margaret came into his life. September arrived, bringing slightly cooler temperatures and the start of the school year. Margaret was busy from dawn to dusk with her students, but she still made time for Thomas every day. They fell into a pattern. Thomas would walk her to the schoolhouse in the morning, the dogs trotting alongside them. He would work whatever jobs he had lined up for the day. At noon, Margaret would meet him for lunch, always bringing enough food for both of them and the dogs, always making sure Thomas ate his full share. In the evening, after school let out, they would spend time together, talking and planning and simply enjoying each other's company. Thomas had never been happier. The grief over his father's death was still there, a dull ache that would probably never fully go away, but it was balanced now by joy, by love, by the promise of a future that held more than just survival. In early October, that future was nearly destroyed. Thomas was working at the livery stable, mucking out stalls when he heard shouting from the street. He dropped his shovel and ran outside, the dogs barking at his heels. A crowd had gathered near the schoolhouse, and Thomas's blood turned to ice. He sprinted toward the commotion, pushing through the crowd until he could see what was happening. 3 men on horseback had cornered Margaret outside the school. Thomas recognized them immediately. They were part of the same group of claim jumpers who had killed his father, and from the way they were leering at Margaret, their intentions were not good. "Come on, schoolteacher," one of them was saying, his voice slurred with whiskey. "We just want to show you a good time." "Leave me alone," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "You are drunk, and you are frightening my students." Indeed, several children were peering out the schoolhouse windows, their faces pale with terror. That small detail, the idea of children watching this, made something snap inside Thomas. "Get away from her," he said, his voice low and dangerous. The 3 men turned to look at him, and recognition flickered across their faces. "Well, well," said the one who had been speaking, a man named Cutter. "If it is not the prospector's whelp, you still sniffing around these parts, boy?" I said, "Get away from her." Thomas moved to put himself between Margaret and the men, the dogs growling at his sides. Cutter laughed. "Or what?" You going to sick your mutts on us? We should have shot them when we shot your old man." The admission, spoken so casually, made rage explode behind Thomas's eyes. But before he could do anything foolish, he felt Margaret's hand on his arm, grounding him. "Thomas," she said quietly, "please." Sheriff Coleman was pushing through the crowd now, his hand on his gun. "What is going on here?" "Nothing, Sheriff," Cutter said, suddenly trying to sound reasonable. "We were just having a friendly conversation with the schoolteacher." "Funny," Coleman said dryly. "It did not look friendly." "I think you boys better move along. We have as much right to be here as anyone," one of the other men protested. "Not when you are drunk and harassing a lady, you do not." Coleman's hand was still on his gun, and his meaning was clear. "Now move along, or I will run you in for disturbing the peace." The three men exchanged glances, clearly weighing their options. Finally, Cutter spat in the dust and turned his horse. "This is not over," he said, though it was unclear whether he was talking to Thomas or the sheriff. They rode off and the crowd began to disperse. Thomas turned to Margaret, his heart still pounding. "Are you all right?" "I am fine," Margaret said, though she was trembling slightly. "Just shaken. Thank you for coming." "Always," Thomas said fiercely. "Margaret, those men, they are dangerous. They admitted to killing my father." "I heard." Margaret looked at Sheriff Coleman. "Is there anything you can do?" Coleman shook his head grimly. "Not without proof. His word against theirs, and they will claim they were just boasting, but I will keep an eye on them. And you, Miss Foster, should be careful. Do not go anywhere alone until this blows over." "I will walk her everywhere," Thomas said immediately. "They will not get near her again." Margaret looked like she wanted to argue, to insist she could take care of herself, but the fear still lingering in her eyes made her nod instead. "All right. Thank you, both of you." That night, Thomas lay awake in his cabin, staring at the ceiling. The dog sensed his agitation and stayed close, Belle resting her head on his chest. Thomas stroked her fur absently, his mind racing. He had been trying to avoid conflict, to keep his head down and build a peaceful life. But those men were not going to leave him alone. And now they had threatened Margaret, which was unforgivable. Thomas knew he had to do something, but he also knew that Margaret was right. Getting himself killed would solve nothing. The solution came to him just before dawn. He would not confront the men directly, but he could make sure they faced justice for what they had done. Sheriff Coleman needed proof. Thomas would get him that proof. Over the next 2 weeks, Thomas spent every spare moment investigating. He talked to miners who had been in the hills the day his father died. He visited the site where his father's body had been found, looking for any evidence that might have been missed. He asked careful questions at the saloon, buying drinks for men who might have heard Cutter and his friends boasting about their crimes. It was slow, dangerous work. Thomas had to be subtle, could not let anyone know what he was doing. If Cutter and his crew found out, they would either destroy the evidence or come after Thomas directly. He kept it secret from everyone, even Margaret, not wanting to worry her. But Margaret was not fooled. "You are up to something," she said one evening as they sat on the porch of his cabin, the dogs dozing nearby. "You have been distracted all week." "Just working," Thomas said, which was not technically a lie. "Thomas Vance, I know you better than that." Margaret took his hand, squeezing it. "Whatever you are doing, please be careful. I cannot lose you." The raw emotion in her voice made Thomas's chest tighten. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed it. "I am being careful, I promise. And when this is done, we can move forward with our lives without looking over our shoulders." "Is this about your father, about those men?" Margaret was too perceptive for her own good. "Yes," Thomas admitted. "I am gathering evidence for the sheriff. Those men need to face justice, Margaret, for my father, and so they cannot hurt anyone else." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. I understand, and I am proud of you for doing this the right way through the law. But Thomas, please, please be careful. They are dangerous. I know, I will be careful. He meant it too. Thomas had no intention of dying before he got to marry Margaret Foster. He had too much to live for now. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A miner named Jenks, who had been present the day of Thomas's father's death, finally agreed to testify. He had been scared before, worried about retaliation, but Thomas's quiet persistence and the promise of Sheriff Coleman's protection convinced him. With Jenks's eyewitness testimony, combined with the physical evidence Thomas had gathered, Coleman finally had enough to make arrests. The sheriff and his deputies rode out one cold November morning and brought in Cutter and his two accomplices. The men protested and threatened, but Coleman was unmoved. They were locked up in the town jail to await trial. Thomas was at the schoolhouse with Margaret when the news reached them. A young boy ran up, breathless with excitement. "Miss Foster, Mr. Vance, the sheriff arrested those bad men, the ones who were bothering Miss Foster." Margaret's eyes went wide. She looked at Thomas, understanding dawning. "You did it. You got them arrested." "Sheriff Coleman did it," Thomas said. "I just helped gather the evidence." Margaret did not say anything. She just threw her arms around him, hugging him tight in front of the schoolhouse and all her students and anyone who happened to be passing by. Thomas hugged her back, relief and joy flooding through him. "It is over," Margaret whispered. "It is finally over." "Not quite," Thomas said. "There still has to be a trial, but yes, the worst is over." The trial took place 2 weeks later. The circuit judge happened to be passing through Quartz Hill, and Sheriff Coleman made sure the case was heard immediately. Thomas testified about finding his father's body. Jenks testified about witnessing the confrontation that led to the shooting. Several other miners corroborated parts of the story. The physical evidence Thomas had gathered, including bullets that matched the guns carried by Cutter and his men, sealed their fate. All three were found guilty of murder and sentenced to hang. Thomas expected to feel triumph, or at least satisfaction. Instead, he just felt tired. Watching the men being led away in chains, he thought about his father and about the senseless violence that had taken him away. He thought about Margaret and the future they were building and how close it had come to being destroyed. He thought about the dogs, waiting patiently at home, and about the life he wanted to live. A life of peace and purpose and love. Margaret found him after the trial, outside the courthouse. She did not ask how he was feeling, just took his hand and held it. They stood together in the late afternoon sun, not speaking, just being present for each other. "It is really over now," Thomas said finally. "Yes," Margaret agreed. "Now we can move forward." "I have been saving money," Thomas said. "I have almost enough for a ring. A proper ring, not just something cheap from the general store. And I am working on plans for a house. A real house with multiple rooms and a porch and a yard for the dogs." Margaret smiled up at him. "That sounds wonderful. But Thomas, you know I do not need anything fancy, I just need you. I know. But I want to give you fancy anyway, you deserve it." "How about we compromise?" Margaret suggested. "A simple ring because I do not need diamonds and gold. And a modest house because we do not need a mansion, but we make it ours together. What do you think?" Thomas thought it sounded perfect. "Together," he agreed. They were married on a clear, cold day in December. The ceremony took place in the schoolhouse, the same building where they had worked side by side preparing for the fall term, where they had started really getting to know each other. The room was packed with townspeople, all of them eager to witness the union of their teacher and the quiet young man with the 3 devoted dogs. Margaret wore a simple dress she had sewn herself, cream-colored with lace at the collar. Thomas wore his best clothes, which were not much, but Margaret had helped him add a new shirt and vest for the occasion. He had never felt more proud or more terrified in his life. The ceremony was performed by a traveling minister who had been passing through town. Thomas's hands shook as he slipped the ring onto Margaret's finger, a simple gold band that had cost him 3 months of savings and was worth every penny for the way her eyes lit up when she saw it. "I, Thomas Vance, take you, Margaret Foster, to be my wife," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I promise to love you, honor you, and care for you all the days of my life. I promise to see you as my equal partner in all things. I promise to build a life with you, a home with you, a future with you." Margaret's eyes were wet with happy tears. "I, Margaret Foster, take you, Thomas Vance, to be my husband. I promise to love you, support you, and stand beside you through whatever life brings. I promise to remind you that you matter, that you are worthy of care and love. I promise to build that life, that home, that future with you, and with whatever family we create together." The minister pronounced them married, and Thomas kissed his wife for the first time. The schoolhouse erupted in applause and cheers. Rusty, Duke, and Belle, who had been waiting outside, began barking joyfully as if they understood what had just happened. The reception was held at the boarding house, with Mrs. Garrison insisting on providing the food and refusing to accept payment. The whole town seemed to turn out, bringing gifts and congratulations. Thomas and Margaret danced together in the boarding house dining room, which had been cleared for the occasion, while someone played a fiddle and people clapped along. "Happy?" Thomas asked, holding Margaret close. "Incredibly," she said, beaming up at him. "You—" "More than I knew possible," Thomas said honestly. They stayed at the boarding house that night, Mrs. Garrison having given them her best room as a wedding present. The dog stayed with them, because Thomas could not imagine spending his wedding night without his full family present. Margaret did not object. She had known what she was getting when she married Thomas Vance, a man who loved his dogs as much as he loved her. It was part of what made him who he was. In the morning, they woke to a new life. Thomas and Margaret Vance, husband and wife, ready to build their future together in Quartz Hill, California. The winter passed in a blur of happiness. Thomas continued to work, saving money for the house he was determined to build. Margaret taught her students, her dedication earning her even more respect from the community. In the evenings, they would return to Thomas's cabin, which was cramped and drafty but felt like a palace because they were together. The routine they had established before marriage continued. Thomas would always feed the dogs first. It was too ingrained in him to change completely, but Margaret made sure that he prepared his own meal at the same time. They would all eat together, the dogs with their bowls, Thomas and Margaret at their small table, a family unit complete and content. "You know," Margaret said one chilly January evening as they ate stew by lamplight, "I have been thinking about names." "Names?" Thomas looked up from his bowl, confused for children. Margaret's cheeks flushed slightly. "I mean, it is probably too soon to be thinking about such things, but I am a planner by nature." Thomas felt warmth spread through his chest. They had not talked much about children yet, but he had assumed they both wanted them eventually. "What kind of names were you thinking?" "I have always liked traditional names," Margaret said. "Strong names with meaning. For a boy, maybe Jacob or Samuel. For a girl, maybe Elizabeth or Catherine." "Those are good names," Thomas agreed, "though we have some time before we need to decide, unless there is something you want to tell me." He raised an eyebrow hopefully. Margaret laughed. "No, not yet, but someday I hope. I think you would be a wonderful father." "I hope so," Thomas said. "I would try my best. That is all anyone can do." Margaret reached across the table and took his hand. "We will figure it out together." That promise, that sense of partnership, carried them through the remainder of the winter and into the spring of 1883. Thomas finally saved enough money to begin construction on their house, and he threw himself into the work with enthusiasm. He hired help for the heavier construction, but did much of the work himself, wanting to build their home with his own hands as much as possible. Margaret helped too, despite his protests that she should rest. She was strong and capable, and she refused to sit idle while he worked himself to exhaustion. Together, with the help of several men from town who volunteered their time, they raised walls and laid floors and constructed a roof. The house began to take shape on a piece of land just outside town, close enough to walk to the schoolhouse but far enough for privacy. It was a modest home, just 3 rooms plus a kitchen, but it was solidly built and it was theirs. Thomas made sure to include a large covered porch where the dogs could shelter from sun or rain. Margaret insisted on large windows to let in plenty of light. They argued good-naturedly over every detail, compromising and laughing and slowly turning a pile of lumber into a home. In May, just as the house was nearing completion, Margaret told Thomas she was expecting a baby. Thomas was hammering shingles onto the roof when she called up to him. "Thomas, can you come down for a moment?" He climbed down the ladder, wiping sweat from his forehead. "What is it?" "Is everything all right?" "Everything is perfect," Margaret said, and there was something in her smile that made Thomas's heart skip. "Thomas, I am pregnant. We are going to have a baby." For a moment, Thomas could not process the words. Then joy, pure and overwhelming, flooded through him. He let out a whoop of happiness and picked Margaret up, spinning her around. The dogs began barking excitedly, caught up in his joy. "A baby," Thomas said, setting Margaret down carefully, suddenly worried he had been too rough. "We are going to have a baby. Margaret, that is incredible." "That is perfect. Are you feeling all right? Do you need to sit down? Should you even be out here in the sun?" Margaret laughed at his sudden flood of concern. "I am fine, Thomas. I am pregnant, not fragile, but yes, we are going to have a baby. Sometime in late November or early December, the doctor thinks." "Just in time to move into the new house," Thomas said, looking at the structure behind him with new eyes. This was not just a house anymore. This was where they would raise their child, where they would build their family. The weight of that responsibility was enormous, but Thomas felt ready for it. With Margaret by his side, he felt ready for anything. The news spread through Quartz Hill quickly, met with congratulations and well wishes. Mrs. Garrison cried with happiness and immediately began knitting baby clothes. Mr. Patterson at the general store started setting aside supplies they might need. Sheriff Coleman, gruff as ever, allowed that it was good to see decent folks starting families in town. Thomas redoubled his efforts to finish the house. He wanted everything perfect before the baby arrived, wanted Margaret to have time to settle in and prepare. He worked from dawn until dusk, often by lamplight after the sun set. Margaret scolded him for overdoing it, but she understood. This was how Thomas showed love, through action and dedication. The house was finished in July. They moved in on a blazing hot day, all their worldly possessions fitting in a single wagon. It was not much, but it was theirs. That first night they sat on their new porch and watched the sun set over the desert hills. The dogs sprawled at their feet, and Thomas felt a contentment so deep it almost hurt. "This is everything I never knew I wanted," he said quietly. Margaret rested her head on his shoulder. "Me too. A home, a husband I love, a baby on the way. What more could anyone ask for?" "Nothing," Thomas said. "This is enough. This is more than enough." Margaret's pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer and into the fall. She continued teaching as long as she could, finally reluctantly agreeing to take leave in early October when her condition made standing for long periods difficult. The school board had hired a temporary teacher to cover for her, a young man fresh from back east who was nowhere near as good as Margaret but adequate. Thomas became even more protective, if that was possible. He insisted Margaret rest frequently. He took over all the heavy household chores. And he made absolutely certain she was eating enough, preparing elaborate meals and watching to make sure she finished every bite. Margaret found it equal parts touching and exasperating. "Thomas, I am eating for 2, not 10, she said one evening as he heaped a fourth serving onto her plate. "The doctor said you need proper nutrition," Thomas insisted. "I am getting proper nutrition. You are trying to fatten me like a Christmas goose." But she was smiling as she said it, amused by his concern. The dogs seemed to understand that something important was happening. They became gentler around Margaret, especially Belle, who would rest her head on Margaret's swollen belly and thump her tail contentedly. Duke took to following Margaret everywhere, as if he had appointed himself her personal guardian. Rusty, the oldest, would curl up at her feet whenever she sat down, a warm and comforting presence. "They know," Margaret said one afternoon, stroking Belle's head. "Dogs always know about babies. They will be good with the child," Thomas said confidently. "They are gentle creatures for all their size." He was right. As November arrived and Margaret grew larger and more uncomfortable, the dogs adapted their behavior. They moved more carefully around her. They stopped jumping up in greeting. They seemed to sense that this human they loved needed extra care, and they gave it willingly. The baby came on a cold December night, arriving just as the first snow of winter began to fall. Thomas had been dozing in a chair beside the bed when Margaret shook him awake. "Thomas," she said, her voice tight with pain, "it is time." Thomas was on his feet immediately, suddenly wide awake and terrified. "I will get the doctor. Do not move. Just breathe. I will be right back." He ran through the dark streets of Quartz Hill to the doctor's house, pounding on the door until Dr. Warren emerged, bleary-eyed but alert when Thomas gasped out that Margaret's time had come. They rushed back to the house together, Thomas's heart racing with fear and excitement. The next several hours were the longest of Thomas's life. Dr. Warren sent him out of the bedroom, saying he would just be in the way, so Thomas paced the main room like a caged animal. The dogs picked up on his anxiety and paced with him, whining softly. From behind the closed door, Thomas could hear Margaret's cries of pain, and each one felt like a knife to his heart. He wanted to help, to do something, but he was powerless. All he could do was wait. Finally, as dawn began to break and the snow continued to fall softly outside, Thomas heard a new sound. The thin, angry wail of a newborn baby. His knees nearly buckled with relief. Dr. Warren emerged a few minutes later, smiling tiredly. "Congratulations, Thomas. You have a healthy baby boy." A boy, a son. Thomas felt tears prick his eyes. "And Margaret, is she all right?" "She is tired and sore, but she is fine. She did beautifully. You can go in now." Thomas entered the bedroom on shaking legs. Margaret was propped up in bed, her hair damp with sweat, her face pale with exhaustion. But she was smiling, and in her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. "Thomas," she said softly, "come meet your son." Thomas crossed the room and sat carefully on the edge of the bed. Margaret shifted the bundle so he could see the baby's face. Thomas looked down at his son for the first time and felt his entire world shift and realign. The baby was tiny, red-faced, with a dusting of dark hair and eyes that were trying to focus on this new, overwhelming world. "He is perfect," Thomas whispered. "He is," Margaret agreed. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy, but now, looking at his son, Thomas knew exactly what felt right. "What about James? After your father?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Her father had died when she was 16, and she still missed him terribly. James Vance, I love it. Papa would have been so proud. James, it is. Thomas reached out a finger and the baby's tiny hand wrapped around it with surprising strength. The simple gesture made Thomas's throat tight with emotion. Hello, James, I am your father. I promise I will do my best by you. I will work hard and keep you safe and teach you everything I know. And your mother will teach you even more because she is the smartest person I have ever met. Margaret laughed softly. We will both teach him. Together. Together, Thomas agreed, Doctor. Warren left after making sure Margaret and the baby were both healthy and comfortable. Thomas stayed by the bed, unable to tear his eyes away from his wife and son. When the dog scratched at the bedroom door, whining to be let in, Thomas opened it carefully. The three hounds entered quietly, as if they understood this was a solemn moment. They approached the bed slowly, sniffing curiously at the new small human. Gentle, Thomas said softly, though he need not have worried. The dogs were careful, sniffing the baby with soft, interested huffs, but making no move to jump or bark or do anything that might startle him. Belle licked Margaret's hand gently, her tail wagging low as if to say congratulations. They approve, Margaret said, smiling. Of course they do. He is family. That day established a new rhythm in the Vance household. Thomas took over all the household duties while Margaret recovered from the birth. He cooked, cleaned, cared for the dogs, and brought Margaret and James whatever they needed. He prepared careful meals and made sure Margaret ate well to keep up her strength for nursing. And true to form, he made sure to eat right alongside her, their old pattern continuing even as their family expanded. The dogs adapted to having a baby in the house with remarkable grace. They seemed to understand that James was small and fragile and needed protection. When he cried, which was often in those early weeks, they would hover anxiously until someone picked him up. When he slept, they would lie near his cradle, silent guardians. Thomas had worried about how the dogs would react to a baby taking up so much of his and Margaret's time and attention, but his fears proved groundless. The dogs simply expanded their pack to include one more. The town of Quartz Hill was delighted with the new arrival. Visitors streamed through the house for weeks, bringing gifts and congratulations. Mrs. Garrison made enough baby clothes to outfit 10 children. Mr. Patterson put together a basket of supplies and refused payment. Even Sheriff Coleman stopped by with a hand-carved wooden rattle, looking embarrassed but pleased when Margaret thanked him warmly. Christmas that year was the best of Thomas's life. They could not afford much. Money was still tight with a new baby and only Thomas working, but it did not matter. They had each other, their son, their dogs, their home. On Christmas morning, Thomas woke before dawn to feed the dogs, as he always did. But when he returned to the bedroom, he found Margaret awake and nursing James. "Merry Christmas," she said softly. "Merry Christmas," Thomas replied, sitting beside them on the bed. "I got you something." He pulled a small wrapped package from his pocket. Margaret opened it carefully with one hand, James still cradled in her other arm. Inside was a delicate silver locket on a chain. "Thomas," she breathed. "It is beautiful, but we cannot afford this." "I have been saving," Thomas said. "I wanted you to have something special. Open it." Margaret did. Inside the locket was a tiny painted portrait of James on one side and one of Thomas on the other. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "How did you manage this?" "There was a traveling artist passing through town. I commissioned it a month ago, so you can always keep us close to your heart." "I love it," Margaret said, leaning over to kiss him. "Thank you, and I have something for you too." She nodded toward the dresser. Thomas retrieved the package sitting there and opened it to find a leather journal, beautifully bound, with his initials embossed on the cover. "For writing down your thoughts, your plans, maybe stories for James when he is older," Margaret explained. I know you are not much for words, but I thought you might like having a place to put them when the mood strikes." Thomas ran his hand over the smooth leather, touched beyond words. "It is perfect, thank you." They spent the rest of Christmas Day quiet and content, taking turns holding James, playing with the dogs, eating the simple but delicious meal Margaret had prepared the day before. It was not fancy or elaborate, but it was everything they needed. As winter gave way to spring and James grew from a tiny newborn into a more robust infant, life settled into a comfortable pattern. Margaret returned to teaching when James was 3 months old, bringing him to school with her. The students were delighted to have a baby in the classroom, and they proved surprisingly helpful, taking turns rocking his cradle when he fussed and entertaining him during breaks. It was unconventional, but it worked for them. Thomas continued to work whatever jobs were available, building up their savings slowly but steadily. He had dreams of expanding their house, maybe buying some land where he could raise horses or cattle, something more reliable than odd jobs. But for now, they were managing. They were happy. That was what mattered. The dogs remained central to their lives. Every morning and evening, Thomas fed them, and every morning and evening, Margaret made sure Thomas ate at the same time. It had become such an ingrained habit that Thomas barely thought about it anymore, but it still mattered. It was their small ritual, a reminder of where they had started and how far they had come. James grew quickly, hitting all his milestones early. He rolled over at 3 months, sat up at 5, and started crawling at 6. The dogs were endlessly patient with him, letting him pull their ears and grab their fur while barely reacting beyond gentle tail wags. By the time James was 8 months old, he could pull himself up using Duke's sturdy frame, and the big dog would stand perfectly still, letting the baby use him as support. "He is going to walk before a year at this rate," Margaret said one evening, watching James cruise around the furniture with determination. "He gets that from you," Thomas said. "Always pushing forward, never satisfied to sit still." "Maybe he gets it from both of us," Margaret countered. "You are the most determined person I know, Thomas Vance. When you set your mind to something, nothing stops you." Thomas thought about that. About the boy he had been, lost and grieving after his father's death. About the dogs he had cared for at the expense of his own well-being. About Margaret showing up and refusing to let him sacrifice himself. About everything they had built together. Maybe Margaret was right. Maybe determination ran in the family. James did indeed walk before his first birthday, taking his first wobbly steps on a warm October afternoon. Thomas and Margaret cheered, and the dogs barked excitedly, caught up in the celebration. James looked so proud of himself, grinning his mostly toothless grin, that Thomas scooped him up and spun him around while Margaret laughed with delight. That night, after James was asleep, Thomas and Margaret sat on their porch as they often did, watching the stars come out over the desert. The dogs were sprawled around them, content and peaceful. Thomas held Margaret's hand, marveling as he often did at how lucky he was. "Do you ever think about your father?" Margaret asked quietly. "About what he would think of all this?" Thomas considered the question. "I do. I think he would be proud, not just of what we have built, but of how we did it, together, as partners." "I think my parents would be proud too," Margaret said. "They always wanted me to find someone who would treat me as an equal, someone who would build a life with me, not just for me. That is what we are doing, is it not, building together?" "Yes," Margaret agreed. "And I would not have it any other way." They sat in comfortable silence, holding hands, surrounded by their family. Thomas thought about the future, about watching James grow up, about maybe having more children someday, about growing old with Margaret by his side. It was a good future, a happy one. The kind of future his 19-year-old self, standing over his father's grave with nothing but 3 dogs and a heart full of grief, could never have imagined. But he had it now, and he was never letting it go. The years that followed were good ones for the Vance family. James grew into a bright, energetic boy who loved the dogs as much as his parents did. He learned to feed them, under Thomas's careful supervision, mimicking his father's care and dedication. When James was 3, Margaret became pregnant again, and this time they welcomed a daughter they named Catherine. 2 years after that, another son arrived, whom they named Samuel. The house that had seemed spacious with just Thomas and Margaret became crowded with 3 children, 3 dogs, and all the chaos that came with a growing family. But it was a happy kind of crowded, full of laughter and love and the comfortable mess of a well-lived life. Thomas had long since expanded his work beyond odd jobs. He had started a small freight business, using money he had carefully saved to buy a wagon and team. It was hard work, hauling goods between Quartz Hill and Los Angeles, but it was steady and it paid well. Margaret continued teaching, beloved by generations of students who passed through her classroom. They were respected members of the community, known for their hard work, their dedication to family, and their kindness to others. Thomas had a reputation for being someone who could be counted on, who kept his word and treated everyone fairly. Margaret was considered one of the best teachers in the region, turning out students who were well educated and prepared for whatever future they chose. But for all their success and respect, Thomas and Margaret never forgot where they had started. Every morning and evening without fail, Thomas fed the dogs. And every morning and evening, Margaret made sure Thomas ate at the same time, right alongside them. It was their ritual, the foundation on which everything else had been built. A reminder that taking care of others and taking care of yourself were not opposing forces but complementary ones. The children grew up watching this ritual, learning from it. James, who was serious and responsible like his father, took to helping feed the dogs as soon as he was old enough. Catherine, who had her mother's fierce intelligence and determination, would sit with them at mealtimes and insist everyone eat together as a family. Samuel, the youngest, was the one who could always make everyone laugh, but he too absorbed the lesson that family, whether human or animal, meant taking care of each other. Rusty was the first of the dogs to pass, dying peacefully in his sleep when James was 6 years old. Thomas grieved deeply for the old hound who had been with him through his father's death and the early years of his marriage. They buried Rusty on a hill overlooking their property, marking the grave with a simple wooden cross. James cried at the funeral, and Thomas held his son close, teaching him that it was all right to grieve for the animals we love. Duke followed 2 years later, and then Bell the year after that. Each loss hit Thomas hard, but by then he had new dogs, younger ones he had been training. The pack continued, evolving but never disappearing. There would always be dogs in the Vance household, always animals to care for and love. By 1895, when Thomas was 32 and Margaret 31, they were firmly established in Quartz Hill. Their freight business had expanded to include 3 wagons and several employees. Margaret had become the head teacher at a new, larger schoolhouse the town had built. Their children were growing up strong and happy. Their home, which they had expanded twice, was the center of a life well lived. One evening in late summer, after the children were in bed and the dogs were fed and everything was quiet, Thomas and Margaret sat on their porch as they had done countless times before. Thomas was 32 now, no longer the gaunt, grieving boy who had fed his dogs before himself because he did not believe he deserved more. Margaret was 31, no longer the determined young teacher newly arrived in town. But the core of who they were, the love and partnership that defined them, remained unchanged. "You ever regret it?" Thomas asked suddenly. "Staying here in a small desert town, you could have gone anywhere, taught anywhere. You could have had an easier life." Margaret looked at him like he was crazy. "Thomas Vance, I have never regretted a single day. This is exactly where I want to be. With you, with our children, with our life. Why would you even ask that?" "I just want to make sure you are happy," Thomas said. "That has always been the most important thing to me." "I am happy," Margaret said firmly. "Incredibly, wonderfully happy. Are you happy?" Thomas thought about his life. About the business he had built, the family he had created, the woman beside him who had taught him that his own well-being mattered as much as anyone else's. About the fact that he now ate regular meals, had meat on his bones, could look at himself in the mirror and see a man of substance rather than the half-starved boy he had been. "I am happy," he said. "More than I ever thought possible." Margaret smiled and took his hand. "Then that is all that matters." They sat together as the stars came out, holding hands, surrounded by the life they had built together. The dogs, the current generation of the pack, sprawled at their feet. Inside the house, their children slept safely. In the town beyond, their business and Margaret's school represented the future they were helping to create. Thomas had started with nothing but 3 dogs and a determination to care for them even at his own expense. Margaret had seen that dedication and made sure it did not destroy him, insisting that he take care of himself too. From that simple beginning, from that fundamental act of caring, everything else had grown. It was a good life, Thomas thought as he sat with his wife under the stars. A very good life indeed, and that life continued, year after year, building on the foundation of love and partnership and mutual care that Thomas and Margaret had established. James grew up to take over the freight business, expanding it even further. Catherine became a teacher like her mother, eventually taking over the Quartz Hill School when Margaret finally retired. Samuel, the charmer, surprised everyone by becoming a veterinarian, the first in the region, carrying on his father's love of animals in a new way. Thomas and Margaret watched their children grow and thrive with deep satisfaction. They became grandparents, then great-grandparents. The years marked them with gray hair and laugh lines and the comfortable aches of bodies well used, but their love never diminished. If anything, it grew deeper, enriched by decades of shared experiences and weathered storms. Through it all, the ritual continued. Even when Thomas was in his 60s and needed James's help to carry the heavy bags of dog food, he still fed the dogs every morning and evening. And Margaret, even when arthritis made cooking difficult, still made sure Thomas ate at the same time. Their children and grandchildren grew up watching this, learning from it, carrying the lesson forward into their own lives. On Thomas's 70th birthday in 1923, the whole family gathered for a celebration. Children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren filled the house and spilled out into the yard. There was food and music and laughter, the kind of joyful chaos that comes with a large, loving family. At one point, James, now a middle-aged man with children of his own, stood up to make a toast. "To my father," he said, raising his glass, "who taught me that caring for others is the highest calling, but that caring for yourself is just as important. Who showed me through example what it means to be a good man, a good husband, a good father. And to my mother, who saw a young man sacrificing himself for his dogs and made sure he learned to value himself as much as he valued them. Together, you built something remarkable. Not just a business or a family, but a way of living that all of us carry forward. Thank you for everything." The toast was echoed by everyone present, and Thomas felt tears prick his eyes. He looked at Margaret, still beautiful to him despite the years, and squeezed her hand. She smiled at him, her eyes bright with happy tears. "We did all right, did we not?" she said quietly. "We did more than all right," Thomas replied. "We did magnificently." That night, after all the guests had left and the house was quiet again, Thomas and Margaret sat on their porch one last time. The current dogs, descendants of Rusty, Duke, and Belle, lay at their feet. The desert stretched out before them, beautiful and harsh and home. "I love you, Margaret Vance," Thomas said. "I have loved you from the moment you made me eat alongside my dogs, and I will love you until my last breath." "I love you too, Thomas Vance," Margaret replied. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, and I thank God every day that I stepped off that stagecoach in Quartz Hill all those years ago." They held hands and watched the stars, content in the knowledge that their story was complete. They had lived fully, loved deeply, and left a legacy that would continue through their children and grandchildren. The boy who had fed his dogs before he fed himself had learned to value his own life. The woman who had insisted he eat alongside them had found a partner worthy of her strength and dedication. It was, in the end, exactly the kind of love story the Wild West needed. Not about gunslingers or gold or grand adventures, though there had been moments of all of those. But about two people who found each other, who built a life together through hard work and mutual respect and unwavering love, who taught their family that caring for others and caring for yourself were not competing needs but essential parts of a whole. As the years drew to a close, as Thomas and Margaret aged into their 70s and then their 80s, they remained partners in every sense of the word. They were still holding hands when Thomas passed peacefully in his sleep in 1931, at the age of 78. Margaret followed him 6 months later, unable and unwilling to live long without her beloved husband. They were buried side by side on the hill overlooking their property, where generations of dogs had been laid to rest before them. Their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren gathered to remember them, telling stories of their love and dedication and the remarkable life they had built together. And in Quartz Hill, California, their legacy lived on, in the freight company that still bore the Vance name. In the school, where Catherine taught her own students about dedication and learning. In the veterinary practice Samuel had established. In the countless people whose lives they had touched over the decades. But most of all, their legacy lived on in the simple lesson they had taught through their example. That love means caring for others, but it also means allowing others to care for you. That sacrifice has its place, but so does self-preservation. That the strongest partnerships are built on mutual respect, and the insistence that both people matter equally. Thomas Vance had fed his dogs before he ever fed himself. Margaret Foster had made sure he ate right alongside them. And from that simple beginning, they had built a life that would be remembered and celebrated for generations to come. A love story for the ages, set against the backdrop of the Wild West, proving that the greatest adventures are not always found in danger and excitement, but in the quiet, daily choice to love and be loved in return. And in the end, that was everything.